Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Draft Series. I'm solo today to talk about Diego Pavia. Pavia is a quarterback for Vandy this year, but has had a long journey to get to this point. He's an older prospect. He was born in 2002, so one of the older guys in this class. But Pavia did not start at Vanderbilt. Pavia started at a JUCO in New Mexico, transferred up to New Mexico State, had success at both of those levels. I think won a national championship in JUCO. From that point on, had success at New Mexico State and was probably most famous for his game against Auburn, where they went into Jordan Hare and upset Auburn a couple years ago. From there, he was on the map enough to have some opportunities to transfer up again and spent his last 2 years of his career at Vanderbilt, where he had a lot of success, brought Vanderbilt to heights that they haven't reached since the James Franklin years, and was one of the most talked about and discussed players in all of college football, both for his play style on the field, but also for some of the antics off the field, which we'll get into in this evaluation. First, I want to start with the positive for Pavia, but before I get into some of the details there, I think it's important to put into context who this type of player is. Pavia is the typical type of guy where when you watch him, you think, this is the guy that is a really, really good college quarterback, but is probably not going to fully transfer over to the NFL. And the guys that typically fit that bucket are the guys that overly rely on their legs in college. Guys that are undersized, guys that rely more on making plays in the open field rather than winning from the pocket. All of those things fit Pavia to a T. So naturally going into the evaluation, the way you're thinking about it is, this is a college guy who's probably not going to translate. But let's get into it with him and unpack whether that's really the case, or is there actually some NFL upside here? So let's start with some of the good things. The most obvious thing, the thing you probably will hear people talk about the most with Pavia, is his competitiveness and his underdog mentality. This is something with him that has carried him throughout his college career. Sometimes it's abrasive. We'll get to kind of the negative parts of that later. But this is a big part of his game and is one of the reasons why he's had so much success. I think the biggest potential misconception with Pavia is that this guy is unprepared, going out there and winging it, doesn't really think the game, is just kind of more of a Johnny Manziel type of guy. And there are a lot of ways that the Johnny Manziel comp applies. I'll get to that later. But one of the ways where I do think Pavia is very impressive is in his preparation and in his overall attitude towards football. Pavia was known for getting into the facility before most guys are waking up. He has been in college long enough where I think he was able to treat football as pretty much a full-time job. But Pavia clearly is a guy that is involved in the mental aspect of the game and not just the physical, which is, I think, something that some of these guys that are just the physical freaks in college are unable to translate with the NFL. Pavia doesn't have that problem. He does have the ability to think the game. That is a skill that he has demonstrated to this point. Outside of that and getting into more of the actual on-field results, the biggest thing that you see with Pavia is the creative playmaking. He's a guy that when he gets outside of the pocket, he sees the field very well. He's elusive and sudden in his movements, and he understands how to create just enough space to get a throw off. He understands how to make guys miss in space and continue to challenge defenders late into downs when he probably already should have been sacked, but has somehow still kept the play alive to this point. Pavia also does a really good job of, with the limitations he has from a size perspective, still being able to hit throws in the short to intermediate area of the field for the most part when plays break down. And so that's something with Pavia that, yes, he is known as more of a runner, but there are pieces of his game where the throwing is pretty solid. In addition to that, I think Pavia does a good job of when he's scrambling, he truly is looking for plays down the field. This is not just a guy that decides he's going to take off and run and lowers his head, completely gives up on any sort of indication of throwing the ball. That's not Pavia. Pavia is still looking to make plays throwing the ball, which I think is a big positive for his game, because I'm not sure he's the kind of athlete that can simply rely on that in the NFL. He was a good college athlete. I'm not sure his speed's good enough for that to be what allows him to have real NFL success. I think the playmaking does need to come more from his ability to create more time, give time for receivers to break open, and then find them for a big play. So I think that's something Pavia will continue to have to rely on, and will potentially do so even more in the NFL than how he is right now. Another thing that I think is a positive with Pavia is there's potential for him to play some different types of roles in the NFL. I think recently he had an interview with John Gruden where Gruden asked him about potentially taking on some of that Taysom Hill type role. I think Pavia is not the athlete that Taysom Hill is, but I do think you still see ways where you could use him in specific packages, maybe in the red zone or in short yardage situations, and install specific packages for him as he's your backup. So if you have a quarterback that you don't love as your starter, maybe he gives you a little bit different element in certain situations of the game. NFL teams are a little less prone to do that because most teams have a guy they want on the field, but if you are a team that you don't have a quarterback you love, maybe this gives you a little bit different dimension. What I think was most impressive to me in terms of what differed from what I expected watching the film, I thought he was a much better thrower than what I was expecting. He has pretty good arm strength for a guy his size. He also has bigger hands for a guy that's 5'10", which I think you can see. Like he controls the ball pretty well, even when he's throwing on the run. And a lot of smaller guys just don't have the ability to do that. A lot of smaller guys struggle with actually being able to aim and direct the ball when they're on the run like that. And I think that's something Pavia does very well. In addition to that, I think Pavia is a lot more comfortable throwing into tight windows than I would have expected. He sees the field pretty well. The caveat to that, and we'll get to this in more detail in some of the clips that I talk about, is Pavia has a good sense of his offense and the timing that he needs to run it with. However, there are times where if he's in the middle of the field and he's in the middle of the pocket, he's just physically not going to be able to see a guy because the defense is going to be positioned in a way where a defensive lineman or an offensive lineman is blocking his vision, right? That just goes back to the height concerns. But when he actually has the physical ability to see a throwing window one way or the other, I think he processes pretty well and is comfortable throwing the ball into tight windows, which for a lot of these types of scrambling quarterbacks is just not something that's a part of their game. Like I said, in general, I think his processing is pretty good. Vandy trusted him a lot to make different decisions on RPOs where, he might have the option to run towards the outside, but then a tight end is leaking out, giving him a little outlet in case the defense collapses on him. They trust him to make quick decisions in the RPO game, as well as take some shots down the field. And he had the ability and the option to do that in the Vanderbilt offense. I do think Vandy's coaches did a great job of putting him in positions to succeed as well. This was a very well-structured offense to assist Pavia and maximize his abilities. Okay, I think that's everything for Pavia on the positives. To me, there was more there than I expected, especially from the throwing. There are legit NFL throws on his tape. The question is just like, how often will he be able to get those off at the next level? Now let's get to the concerns with Pavia. And let's go back to, again, some of the intangible stuff. Pavia does have some off-the-field concerns. He's definitely known as a partier, somewhat of a brash, arrogant guy. He called out the Heisman voters after he finished in second, right? There's some things that cause people to dislike Pavia, and understandably so. I will say this stuff doesn't scare me too much from an NFL team perspective, because I do think this guy's a super hard worker. I would have more concerns about this if this was a guy that was not a hard worker, because the guys that talk a lot and don't work a lot, that just don't survive in the NFL, and they become hated very quickly by the locker room. I think Pavia will be super well liked by his teammates because they will see how hard he works. Opposing fans might dislike him. The only question I have here is just, Does a team shy away from drafting him because potentially he's a little bit more of a distraction? I don't think he's a high enough level of distraction for it to matter a ton. I don't think this is like a Tim Tebow type situation where the celebrity had blown up to the point where this guy was the leading topic on First Take, leading an okay Broncos team to the playoffs, mainly backed by their defense. Pavia is not that level of stardom. He's not Johnny Manziel's level of stardom. So I'm not super concerned about those things. I think it's reasonable for people to dislike him based off that. I'm not sure it's going to hurt him too much in the draft. The other complete obvious concern here is just the size. And it's easy for me to just say that and move on, but it is a huge deal for a guy to be 5'10". And we talked about it in our Lessons Learned podcast this year with John. There are just plays that if you are that size of a quarterback, you just won't be able to make them. And you have to be so perfect at everything else and so comfortable with your anticipation and timing like a Drew Brees, where there's so many things that have to go right for you to be able to fully compensate for that. And there are plays on tape where you see the size come up. I will show one of those in a minute. This is not just a look at the number on the page and make a judgment. However, it is almost impossible for somebody to be 5'10" and for it not to negatively impact them when they're playing the quarterback position in the NFL. It's a big concern for him, and it's one of the biggest reasons why he won't be one of the first quarterbacks drafted this year. I genuinely think if he was 6'3", like, we'd probably be talking about him as a first or second round pick. Like, it makes that big of a difference, and a lot of teams are just going to write him off because of it. Another concern I have with Pavia is he is a guy that's a pretty physical runner, but he's not a huge guy. He's 5'10". He is 207, which for a 5'10" guy is pretty well built. But in general, he does take a lot of hits. He likes to run lowering his shoulder. I think he'll be able to learn from this in the NFL and slide, but my concern there is he's super competitive. You see some of these guys, Jackson Dart's another one, where I think they just almost take it as an insult to not be able to challenge defenders. Pavia, I think, wants to challenge guys, and he wants to play a physical style. There are some injury questions there for sure. Pavia, like I said, was more impressive from the pocket than I initially expected, but he is still not going to win from the pocket as much as a typical starting level NFL quarterback. And it's not really anything of his doing. It's just he's a lot of times not big enough to really play from the pocket in that manner. There are also times where he will bail from a pocket that's probably manageable because he has a feel for, I'm probably better off just trying to make a play in the open field. That stuff just doesn't happen as much in the NFL. In the NFL, he will have to operate in dirtier pockets more frequently. And so I think you're only going to see that become more of a problem for him as he gets to the NFL. In addition to that, I thought you saw times against better teams, especially against Alabama, where his decision-making deteriorated, especially when they were losing. This isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. When you're losing, you do want to take more risks. You want to try to take shots down the field, especially if you're down multiple scores. Like, at some point, you've got to score, right? There's a limited clock. You've got to get down the field and score. But I think there were times where he was pressing, and against against better teams, when some of those typical options that Vandy would get to weren't presenting themselves as frequently, I think you would see him start to press. It doesn't surprise me given his competitive nature, but it is something that concerns me because in the NFL, things are never going to be easy. You're always going to have to be patient. You're going to have to take what's there and not press, even when you're facing a defense that's giving you a tough challenge that day. One other thing this is more so, again, relative to expectation of watching him and relative to his reputation. I am not sure he has the speed I was expecting. There's a lot of times where he's making guys miss, but there's a few times where he gets out and breaks in the open field and is able to run pretty well, but there are fewer examples of just unbelievable athleticism on his tape. For example, Kyler Murray is a guy that was like 5'9", that was drafted first overall. His athleticism was just otherworldly at Oklahoma. That's not what we're talking about with Pavia. He's a really good athlete, but he's not in the Kyler Murray bucket in terms of athleticism. Still overall, like, very impressive in that regard. I also didn't love him when they would just run him as a design runner, especially just in between the tackles. He's just not a big guy. It's just kind of challenging for him to navigate some of those. But when there's broken plays, when he's got opportunities in space, he does a really good job. Okay, I think that's everything on the bad things. So now let's get into some of the clips. I think Pavia has some really fun tape. You see a lot of explosive plays, a lot of exciting football. So let's get into those and talk more about some specifics based on some of these clips. All right, first play here against South Carolina. I thought he was really impressive in this game against South Carolina, so we're going to look at a few different plays from this game. We'll also look at a play from the Bama game and a play from the Missouri game this year. First play here is an example of what I think surprised me the most about his film, which is he is a legitimately impressive thrower of the ball. So they run play action here. He's rolling out to his left. We see so many times, in the Klubnik breakdown, we talked about how often Klubnik rolled to his right, which is usually the more natural position for a guy to throw from. Pavia is able to, even rolling to his left, turn his hips and throw a very accurate ball on a line to a defender that's 15 to 20 yards down the field. This is a legitimately tough throw for most college quarterbacks to make, and he delivers it pretty easily. And especially for a smaller guy, this is very impressive stuff. Good timing, good ball placement, good accuracy. Just a very solid rep from a throwing perspective. Again, another play against South Carolina. Eli Stowers, their tight end, is running a route up the field here where his goal is just to kind of get around this zone defender and present a throwing window before the safety is able to crash down. Pavia here, look at when he's throwing this ball. He's already rearing back to throw this. He trusts Stowers. Stowers is a really talented player, and he understands that he needs to fit this ball in a tight window if he's going to throw this ball to Stowers. So he's already making this throw, gets it in the perfect position where now this safety does not have the ability to crash down. Stowers ends up not making this catch. Again, sometimes your guys aren't going to make plays, but Pavia does a really good job here of throwing with timing and accuracy and almost hit Stowers for what would be a big gain. One thing you'll notice here, and one thing that we'll see on later tapes when the pocket's not as clean, is when the pocket's clean like this, Pavia can rip some throws, right? But it's pretty abnormal to have this big of a throwing window to make a throw over the middle of the field. And we'll see other times where he struggles with that a little bit more. One more play against South Carolina here. Again, this highlights his anticipation and accuracy as a thrower. One thing you'll notice that I do want to call out is Pavia naturally has to take a deeper drop on some of these throws down the field. And a lot of times he'll kind of hop around for a little bit before he eventually gets into his throw. This isn't ideal for a few reasons. One, it's just a little harder to throw when you don't have that natural timing of your typical drop back, planting, and throwing. The other thing is when he drops back this far, it is a lot easier for defensive linemen to work upfield, which you don't necessarily see on this snap. Vandy's offensive line does a good job. But the further back you go, the more of a straight line the defensive linemen have to get back. And that's something he just has to do because of his size. You see here, he drops back super deep, has plenty of time to make a decision here, and he's going to rip a throw across the middle of the field here to pick up a first down on 3rd and long. Again, a really impressive throw for Pavia to be able to be willing to attempt these kind of throws across the middle of the field with some pressure coming down. This is not an easy throw. Again, finds his guy, picks up a big first down. This is the kind of stuff that is really impressive in his NFL type stuff on his tape, outside of maybe the way he has to manage the pocket, right? That's a little bit different than what you typically see from an NFL guy. All right, one play here against Bama where you really see the struggles come from in the pocket. So here, Vandy's offensive line is not as dominant. They are giving up a little bit of ground on the interior. And this is just a muddy pocket, right? This is just a little bit of a difficult lens for Pavia to look through. And because of that, he just doesn't see this play well at all. Here, this receiver, he's got no shot. There's two different defenders that have a chance to make a play on this ball, right? This safety crashes down, ends up making the interception, and it's a big negative play with Vandy deep into Alabama territory, right? Here, you probably should just check this ball down, hope your guy's able to make a guy miss, and you've got 2nd and reasonable. There's times where he's just not going to see the field as well as a bigger guy. I think overall, like I said, his processing's pretty strong. I don't think that Pavia fails to read out plays well. It's just sometimes he's not going to see the field as well as a guy that is bigger. And he does have an aggressive mindset, so sometimes these mistakes are going to pop up on his tape. So again here, let's look at the end zone view. This gives a little bit better angle, I think, of how the clouded picture can get sometimes. So Saab is the safety here that's going to end up crashing down. You see him realize where the route is, come up and make this play. Pavia also does target Stowers all the time because he was their best offensive weapon. Alabama was aware of that and I think was able to take advantage of it on that play. All right, last play, and this play is what you think of when you think of Diego Pavia. So let's just let it roll. There's not much to break down here. Play action, there's pressure. He rolls out, just trying to make something happen. By the way, here, there is a holding penalty, so this play gets negated. This didn't end up being a touchdown, but you could still see on his tape what you're wanting to see here. So he's looking for a guy, and now he decides, okay, I need to run. And what does he do? There's about 7 defenders chasing him, and none of them can get to him, right? He is just a very creative runner. He has good vision. And on top of that, he's just a very competitive player. He's not just going to give up on a play. If he thinks there's still a small chance that maybe if he continues to cut back, that he'll have a chance to score, he's going to give it a shot. And here, he makes a couple guys miss, ends up beating everybody back to the other side of the field. This play obviously negated due to a holding penalty, but impressive nonetheless from Pavia. All right, that does it for the clips. Again, like I said, I hope those clips show some of the ability from the pocket that I was talking about because I do think that stuff's a lot more impressive than I was originally expecting. So wanted to highlight that. I'm sure if you're watching this, you've seen Pavia work with his legs a lot and seen him do a lot of things like that last play against Missouri. All right, let's get to the comps that I have for Pavia. It's sometimes hard to come up with comps for guys that are physically just very different from most guys that enter the NFL. This is kind of the same thing that you go through with some bigger prospects, right? Like Sawyer Robertson, with him being as little of a scrambler as he was, it kind of limits your sample size. Same thing's true here with Pavia, right? There's just not that many guys that have been successful in the league at this size. So none of these comps are perfect, but my worst case, I mentioned this earlier, is Johnny Manziel. And it's partially, I think, because, if Pavia does not handle himself well off the field, which I think there are some rightful concerns to have there, maybe he ends up not getting a true fair shake at it, meaning that his talent will not be the only thing that decides if he gets to stick in the NFL and have a chance to play. I could see that happening. I also do think there's legitimate play style similarities in that Manziel was way better in the open field and operating in chaos. He threw up a ton of 50-50 balls to Mike Evans in his time at Texas Tech, and that, relying on that in the NFL is just not going to work. Manziel also just didn't really know how to process the game, and that's where I do think Pavia is a better player than Manziel, at least from an NFL perspective. He wasn't as electric in college as Manziel was. But I do think there's a chance Pavia just does not work whatsoever in the NFL, similar to Manziel, because the play style just does not translate. So that's my worst case. My best case, this does not fit in terms of the college success profile, but I think the way that Pavia would have to win in the NFL reminds me of how Bryce Young has to win, which is an extremely limited, game relative to most quarterbacks from the pocket, but Young is a super accurate thrower, more so than Pavia for sure, but very accurate thrower. He has a pretty strong ability to think and process the game, and he has creativity on the move and enough escapability to lengthen plays and make plays doing that. Now, do I think Bryce ever becomes more than the 17th best quarterback in the NFL? I really don't. And I think that's basically Pavia's ceiling. I'd be stunned if Pavia ever became an above-average NFL quarterback, just given the physical limitations that we're working with here. But would I be shocked if 5 years from now Pavia was the 20th best quarterback in the NFL? I don't think I would. I've seen enough on film from him, from a passing perspective, that I don't think he's a lost cause there. And he's a strong enough and athletic enough runner when you pair that with what I think is pretty impressive processing and throwing tape, he's got a chance. Now, there's enough limitations and concerns about the size that I don't think this means he's some great prospect. I'll get to my grade in just a minute. But my comp for Bryce Young being his best case, I think that is about, the 20th best quarterback in the NFL. I don't think that's impossible for Pavia. Bryce was a significantly more polished prospect, also a significantly younger prospect, so you expected more growth from him as an NFL player. So he's certainly not the prospect that Bryce Young was, but that to me is more so what you're thinking about from a best case in terms of the play style that would be necessary for him to succeed. All right, so let's get into the grade. I have a 5th round grade on Diego Pavia, which is better than Cade Klubnik, right? Better than Sawyer Robertson, who I've watched to this point. I enjoyed watching Pavia. It's a different watch. It's a very competitive watch, and enjoyed watching him. There's some natural limitations to his game that I don't think will ever go away. But I don't really want to fully bet against this guy because he's already proven at 3 different levels that he's been able to jump up in competition and not miss a beat. So I'm not fully writing him off, but there are certainly other more prototypical quarterbacks in this class that I would want to prioritize over him, like Simpson, Nussmeier. Obviously, Mendoza is in a completely different class. So an interesting late round flyer. I think he gets drafted, but I don't feel great about that just because I think a lot of teams will write him off because of the size. But yeah, I think this is a legit mid-round guy, and it wouldn't stun me if he has a little bit of success in the NFL. That's going to do it for today's episode. We will be back again with more quarterback breakdowns as we get closer to the draft, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again for watching. The playlist is growing for 2026, so feel free to go back and check out some of the other breakdowns. Those should pop up on the screen here. And thanks for watching. We'll catch y'all soon.